This is Vision 8, and the title of today's presentation is Transformation. Transformation. We know by the late 20th century that energy, in order to exist, must be discontinuous. This is a very difficult point to understand initially, but once one understands it, the light bulb goes on. Energy, in order to exist, must be discontinuous. All energy must be quantized. In other words, it has to exist as definite quanta. And because it exists as quanta, the physics of a universe where that happens is called quantum physics. If energy was continuous, the continuity of energy would be infinite and it would not be able to exist. This is not a mystical point, it's just simply physics. Because an infinite energy, quanta, also would be non-existent. Its infinity would be a zero. It would not register. So that a 21st century mystical definition of God is the continuous energy quanta. God is the continuous energy quanta. And underlies and precedes and postcedes all existence. And because energy, in order to exist, has to quantize itself, it becomes subject to time. So that time as a dimension, temporality as a dimension, is a function of existence as a phenomenon. And so time does not at all belong with space without qualification. So that Niels Bohr had a little beef with Einstein. Einstein liked to talk about space-time, and Niels Bohr liked to talk about quantum universes. In order for energy to move at all, it has to jump from one quanta to another, from one energy level to another. This is apparent in the atom, where an electron, they used to, when I was in high school, which was in another century, seems like, they used to say, well, electrons travel in shells around the nucleus. Well, they don't travel in shells. I mean, imagine, here's a nucleus. Let's just take hydrogen. It's the simplest of all. Hydrogen's the archetypal element. Here's the nucleus of hydrogen. And here's an electron going around the nucleus of hydrogen. There's only one electron. Where is it? If you make a sphere, a shell sphere around that nucleus, where is that electron? Well, it is anywhere on that shell. But there's only one of them, and it has a definite charge, a definite size, though small, nevertheless definite, measurable. And the energy level there is measurable. If that electron receives more energy than that shell locus can handle, the electron will leave that shell. It will jump off the atom. You'll have ionized hydrogen. Or if another electron comes in with exactly that right energy, it will join the element and a slightly different shell, and you'll have a kind of a heavy hydrogen, deuterium. And in fact, you can do this again, and you can produce a hydrogen atom with 3 electrons called tritium. And from that, you can make a nuclear bomb. You cannot make a nuclear bomb from hydrogen. You cannot make it from deuterium, but you can from tritium. All this has to do with discrete energy levels called quanta. In heavier elements, in order for an electron to move up in the shell structure, it has to increase energy. Each of those moves, each of those jumps, each of those quantum jumps is a transformation. Each of them is a transformation. What we're talking about today, we're talking about transformation. We're talking about the way in which it happens in us. And we're trying to characterize it in such a way that you can get a picture of what is happening. But even when you get a picture of what is happening, you will not be able to retain that picture very long. Even after 5 more minutes of me just presenting, the picture will begin to waver. So to cinch a picture, you have to have a frame. The frame for that kind of a picture has a name. It's a structure. We call it, colloquially, an idea. It's a Greek word that Plato brought into usage. Before Plato, the Greek word idea did not function very well at all. And it's in Plato's dialogues that the idea of the idea gains currency to the point to where one can finally get it, grasp it, understand it. The idea holds a picture, and a picture is a gestalt of images. And as we'll see, each of those images is a gestalt in itself. You cannot have a transformation until the idea is clear. Just as you cannot have a picture until the images are clear. That means that in their articulation, they are somewhat separate and different, each image from each other image, so that there's a kind of a space, not a very big space, like a skin. So putting skin on images is an absolute prerequisite to having ideas, which in itself is a prerequisite to having transformation available. Now we do this all the time on very small, minute, atomic, molecular levels. And it isn't just the old example that when you fall asleep at night, when you wake up in the morning, you wouldn't be able to recognize who you were unless you were able to carry something over from before. What do you carry over from before? You carry over the resonances of the pictures of yourself. But if someone schools themselves in meditation. And you sit patiently and you let the body go through a sleep cycle. Say it's really tired, it sleeps 8 hours. And all the time you're witnessing this body goes through its sleep cycle. And when the body wakes up, immediately it is there. It doesn't consult the imagination at all to be there. Why? Because the continuity has something to do with memory and not imagination. Your continuity from day to day is a function of differential memory and not at all of imagination. The problem here is that memory does not function in an integral way. It seems stupid to say it at first. And you think, well, that doesn't sound right. No, it doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound natural. Let's look at it this way. Let's look at it with a kind of a cue for ourselves. We'd like to have some words, a kind of a cue. We're talking about transformation. We're trying to understand how is it that we function. That day after day, year after year, we assume, and quite rightly so, that we're who we are. We don't give much thought to how perilous and precarious that assumption is. It's actually very perilous. It's very easy to disrupt that. There are several million just physical substances that will disrupt that. Let's use as a cue some words from one of our authors coming up starting next week for a month. We're going to take as our next pair Shelley and Shakespeare. Because we generally are working here with the English language, we wanted to have two figures that were able to use the English language spontaneously, creatively, in ways that were completely novel at the time. And Shakespeare and Shelley certainly do that. Although Shelley said of himself with all humility that he admits to being an imitator, if that's the way people want to look at it. Actually, he was a great originator. I'm going to use some of the opening lines to one of his poems called Hymn to Intellectual Beauty. Hymn is a poetic prayer. Originally, a hymn was a poetic prayer. There were two kinds of prayers in ancient times. One was a prayer beseeching help, and that was a kind of a plaintive quality to it. And the other was a prayer not beseeching help, but creating a presence, a space for the divine to come and join one. And very often a hymn was that invitational. Rather than a beseeching, it was an invitational. In a way, the invitational hymn is the cultural equivalent of the electron jumping energy levels. The invitational hymn makes available an energy openness as an extra added part of us so that the divine can come, and a part of the divine can occupy, an electron of God can come and occupy that shell around us. Because actually the experience of that was mystically very accurate. Saints who were able to do that are portrayed as having this shell around their head, this halo, the original halo, was like a thought bubble. And when human beings were first able to do this in a conscientious way, they were literally visually portrayed as having another shell around them, a space of holiness, another energy level, which a part of God could come and join and become a part of you, and you would become energized, higher energy level. And you would transform because that happened. Not because you spent a weekend with Guru X, and not because Guru X and his chutzpah gave you the juice, because you paid him well and he was happy and he was cool and things worked out. He had nothing to do with it. The gurus have nothing to do with your transformation. Your transformation is totally a realistic function of whether you open to space, an energy shell, extra from your mediocre life. Now, I'm not saying you lead mediocre lives, but however you live, a little bit extra openness was added, another energy shell was added. That is transformation. There is nowhere in reality, in this universe or any other universe, whether there be angels and UFOs or not, no transformation happens without this kind of phase form function. Now, in order to add that space, in order to add that extra shell, that extra energy level, which you didn't have in your ordinary life, but now you're making, you have to energize. You have to integrate a little tighter, and as you integrate a little tighter, it releases a little bit more energy and makes that space available. Now, at the level where that spiritual space has to be made available, it's very easy to do it without language. But the energy increment is so slight that if you learn to speak a language, you don't notice that you have been blessed. It's like the human aura, when it's blessed, slightly energizes, just slightly. But if you live in a world where there are electric lights and so forth, you cannot see that slight increment. So you need to have more of an increment, more of an energy, a higher energy order, and language does that then. If you live in the wilderness, you can get used to non-verbal increments of spiritual energy. You learn that you don't have to say a thing. You don't have to beseech. You don't have to say anything. In fact, it's better if you just say nothing. But if you live in a human level where language is functioning, then you have to have this kind of language. And the more that one uses complex language, the higher the energy of the language has to be in order to make the effect. So there's a point of losing ground because the civilization becomes so complex and the language forms so powerful already and so bombarding that in order to have a transformational cue language, it has to be such high poetry that very few people could even write it. So by the time of around 1819, when Shelley wrote his Hymn to Intellectual Beauty, the English language was highly compacted already. And so he had to write something like this in order to get the extra space that allowed for transformation. Here's the kind of language that Shelley used in 1819. The awful shadow of some unseen power floats through, unseen among us, visiting this various world with as inconstant wing as summer winds that creep from flower to flower. It visits with inconstant glances each human heart and countenance, like hues and harmonies of evening, like clouds in starlight widely spaced, like memory of music fled, like aught that for its grace may be dear and yet dearer for its mystery. Spirit of beauty, that dost consecrate with thine own hues all thou dost shine upon of human thought or form, where art thou gone? That delicate spirit of grace that transforms seems, from our perspective, to flee. And it flees instantly that some confusion happens so that the precise energy quanta is not achieved. And what is that precise energy quanta for transformation? It is one existential step above the highest that we employ in our common daily life. Whatever energy levels you have in your being, in your person, in your ordinary life, the transforming energy is the next energy quanta up from that. No more, no less. If it's more, you're not going to transform. You're going to be bowled over. You're going to be awed. You're going to be super stomped. A very poor guru that gives more energy than is necessary. And in fact, a stupid guru who gives energy at all, rather than showing you how to make space so that you get your own energy augmented. All transformations like this. The foundation for this, the foundation that makes this possible, is form. Form has to be complete. It has to be articulate, just like those images. Images have to have that kind of skin around them so that articulate space is able to develop. Because what you're doing is you're not looking just at an image or a couple of images, but you're looking to see the gestalt of all of them together. And the gestalt includes the space as well as the images. You cannot see the space until you're able to see the images clear and see that they do not fill the entire picture. Because if an image fills the entire picture, then you do not have a picture. And an image without articulation tends to go on like an energy without quanta. There are images like that. The space in between stars registers as black, as night, as darkness, because the mind has no image of it. It's actually filled with light. The darkness of space couldn't be brighter. How do we know that it's filled with, not only with light, it's filled with the entire electromagnetic spectrum? You can tune out the various energies from the darkness of space very easily. You could see, oh my God, it was there. It's like if you have a radio. You turn that radio on here, this room is filled with radio waves. Can you imagine that? Even though we don't see it. Because there's no image for it. If you could see radio waves, the room is just seething with radio waves. O.J. Simpson reports are bouncing off the wall. No transformation can happen until there's articulation, and the articulation is bound up with the achievement of form. Somebody mentioned my friend Dr. Heller talking about the Bardo Thodol the other night, Wednesday night. That there are several bardos. And the important existential energy quanta for the Bardo Thodol is that that form, the physical form of that being, be sealed. And someone who is conscious usually seals themselves. But when you have died, you do not have any further control over that body. And so it will leak energy out of the nostrils, out of the ears, out of the anus, out of all the orifices. And so the very first thing that is done is that someone in the Vajrayana will take charge of resealing that body. That body has to be resealed as quickly as possible. How is it sealed? They don't take Scotch tape. It has to be done by the mind. But the only seals that work on human body on that order, on that level, are language, symbolic language forms. That's all that works. 3M Company does not make any sealant that works. And so what is sent out is a single vowel, the vowel which is the root core for the ancient word for heart, for anahata chakra. Hri. Hri. The name of the Heart Sutra is the Hridaya Sutra. Hri. It's the core symbolic vowel for heart. And one sends out Hri and puts Hri on all the orifices, sealing that body. Only then does that body maintain its existential articulation. And the psychic energy within it retains its gestalt, which was characteristic of that person. And only then can the series of transformations happen. And if that's not done, nothing else will happen except dissolution. Now, it's true that there have been supersonic yogis, not many, but there have been some, who do that for themselves, who seal the body before they die. One of the great examples in history on this particular planet was Huineng, the sixth patriarch. He lived in Tang Dynasty China, and he lived in a time where there were very few people who were able to deal on the level at which he was able to deal. And so when Huineng died, because there was no seventh patriarch, there was no one to pass it on to. No one to pass the realization lineage on to. So he had to seal himself. And by sealing himself, he knew then that two things had to happen. One, that there would be no more lineages, and so he prepared for that, being a very good master. Instead of making a lineage that could be passed on one at a time, as it had for about, well, let's see, he was the 34th generation. It had been done 34 times. 34 distinct lifetimes had formed an energy continuum which had actual existence 34 times. And when it came to Huining, he realized that he would have to change the way in which the passing of it on would be, that he wouldn't pass it on to a single discrete existential person. And so he turned himself into a broadcast network and just sort of like switching from Thomas Edison electrical energy to a whole different kind of energy, a Tesla kind of energy. So Huinig broadcast enlightenment into the general airwaves so that anybody who wanted to or who could tune that in, they would be the seventh patriarch. But he also had to seal himself, and so when he sat ready for death, he sealed the body so completely that the body, instead of dissolving, petrified itself. Just like petrified wood, just like wood that where all the minerals crystallize. And because when human flesh petrifies like that, it's very rare, it actually turns coal black, like anthracite coal. In 1937, when Joseph Needham, who was the head of Keyes College and Gonville College at University of Cambridge, England, when he was researching his great series, Science and Civilization in China, all the engineering, all the technology, all the chemistry, and so forth, he went to the temple where Huining's body was, and he took a photograph of it in 1937. Where it is now, I don't know. I don't know anybody who knows. But in 1937, it was exactly where he left it. And that was about 1,300 years ago. Once form is preserved, form is indelible until the existential conditions change enough to modify it. This is wonderful when it comes to functions like preserving your body if you're a super yogi. And it's wonderful in a million other ways, but it's not wonderful, it's unwonderful in an equal million ways. Because that's the root core of the kind of regressive stubbornness that produces resistances to change and transformation all along the line. The same powers that are blessings are also curses. And because so very few people are educated, the blessings are almost never used and the curses pile up. And ineffectual techniques are adopted, like ignoring the resistances by pharmacological means, by illusionary means, by delusionary means, by projective means, all kinds, phobias, everything. All of these ineffectual techniques are used because out of ignorance, one doesn't understand that there are indeed very time-honored ways to make use of this and to take the resistances as cues of possibilities and to use them in transformational ways, which then add blessings. Now, all of this is extremely difficult to keep in mind. One reason of living in solitary wildernesses for whole lifetimes is to make sure that one keeps all these nuances accurate and you don't lose track. And it's extremely difficult. It takes a great deal of practice and facility to come out of the wilderness and come back into town. And the bigger the town, the more difficult it is. So that even when you have someone, like we had in our time, we had somebody who was very proficient at this, Krishnamurti, who's a very good jnana yogi. He wouldn't touch Los Angeles. He stayed out in Ojai Valley, where in the 1920s, Ojai Valley was still pretty nice, pretty pristine. That's as close as you want to get. Only rough and tumble swashbuckler king like Manly Hall would camp out in the center of town. Which is why he was called the chief. Transformation only happens when we make available an extra space as a new part of ourselves. When we make that available, God responds instantaneously. He doesn't send you a letter of intent. So that when it comes to a transformational procedure, I'm going to refer now to Jung's account of transformation in the mass. If you're looking for it in the collected works, it's in volume 11, Psychology and Religion. And the little article, lecture of it before it was in the collected works was in the Uranus yearbooks. And it was published first in 1941. It's collected in this volume, The Mysteries, papers from the Uranus yearbooks. The Mysteries. So volume 11 of the collected works, or The Mysteries. And there is a kind of a arch that happens here. Here's the arch. There are 5 stages, 5 steps that are available here. And they form this little pyramid. And at the very beginning are preliminaries. Okay, preliminaries. Then there's a little arrow, and the next level is oblation. Then there's a little arrow, and the very highest one is consecration. Then there's an arrow coming down, communion. Then there's an arrow coming down, conclusion. Preliminaries and conclusion, oblation and communion, and then consecration at the top. Now, one of the problems about consecration at the top of this curve, is where the space, the energy space for making an openness as a part of you available for divine energy to come down. The procedure got misunderstood in the 2nd century. They missed it. And there was no one around at the time who could get through to these guys. They were all guys. There were people that said, you made a mistake. They ignored them. There were people later on that said, nothing's happening, it's not working. They ignored them. And it went on and on like that, and it's still wrong. It still doesn't work, but it has a psychological placebo effect where people think it works and therefore it does some good, and you can shrug your shoulders and say, well, at least it does that. But what it doesn't do, it does not add the necessary halo to man to make him divine. And that's just as well with these people, because if you were divine once, you would never regress. You would never become mediocre again. And you would never queue up to what they're selling, because you only have to buy it once. And you buy it not by giving something, but by giving up something. By giving up the highest space of energy that you're capable of. One little opening. Now, the true transformation is still preserved in the Mass. And there are mystical writers who later on and all during the whole history, I'll leave out the adjectives, point out and say, like Jung, well, this seems to be the very place. It's an intensification and sometimes was regarded as the actual manifestation of the Lord and hence as the culminating point of the Mass. What is that point? The point, the Greek word for it, epiklesis. Epiklesis. So in his description of what happens during a Mass, Roman numeral 4 is sensing the altar and the substances. Roman numeral 5 is the epiklesis, and Roman numeral 6 is the consecration. Though in the consecration, the priest gives the consecration by his language. This in the Roman Mass is the climax, the transubstantiation of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. The formula for the consecration of the bread runs. It's a formula. And he gives it here in Latin, and I can't read Latin very well. You can look at it later. It's a formula. It's well known. This is a form of black magic. To use language to seal an opening like that assumes that that opening somehow is leaking energy out. And that's why you would use a formulaic consecration. What is the hole out of which the energy is leaking out? That in the Roman Mass has to be sealed by consecrating formulaic words, like their form of free. The opening is the energy level that has no content whatsoever. The ionized space, one energy quanta above the highest that you're able to maintain. And that's what the epiklesis was all about. Epiklesis means an energy laid in by the divine. You make this kind of a form, and God lays the energy in there. There's no way for that energy to be laid in there if this is sealed off by some consecrating formulaic words. And to think that God's energy can be trapped in there by consecration, energy, formulaic words, once it's been laid in, is the height of regressive magic. No being has that power. It doesn't exist. Because when you do that, it means then that one regresses back and becomes just as you were before, but with the illusion that you have a higher power added to you. It's called inflation. That's the psychological term, inflation. And you all know from Alan Greenspan all the dangers of inflation. You're not going to keep your valuation capacity very much if you let inflation get out of hand. Misunderstanding this is extremely difficult to criticize because usually no one ever tells us, shows us, explains to us, just in ABC forms, what the hell's going on. I'll take a break and then we'll come back. Just to follow up on this so that you can sense this idea, we're talking about transformation. Transformation is a process. And this process that has come down has as its archetypal form for the last 2,000 years, its archetypal form is alchemical. The alchemical transformation. We'll talk about this in just a minute. But let's come back to the Mass. Let's come back to Jung writing about transformation symbolism in the Mass. This is in the volume The Mysteries, this is page 277. Furthermore, the officiating priest is an ordinary human being who, although he bears the indelible mark of the priesthood upon him and is thus empowered to offer sacrifice, is nevertheless not yet in position to be the instrument of the divine self-sacrifice enacted in the Mass, nor is the congregation standing behind him, yet purged from sin, consecrated, and itself transformed into a sacrificial gift. The ritual of the Mass takes this situation and transforms it step by step until the climax is reached. The consecration, when Christ himself, as sacrificer and sacrificed, speaks the decisive words through the mouth of the priest. At that moment, Christ is present in time and space. Yet his presence is not a reappearance, and therefore the inner meaning of the consecration is not a repetition of an event which occurred once in history, but the revelation of something existing in eternity, a rending of the veil of temporal and spatial limitations, which separates the human spirit from the sight of the eternal. This event is necessarily a mystery because it is beyond the power of man to conceive or imagine. Now, there are many problems in here. There are many, many problems. It might take 500 pages to go into all of the vicissitudes and nuances of all the problems that are in here. For example, in the 1st century AD, where this particular process was understood pristinely, it was not only understood pristinely, but universally. The 1st century AD had no problem understanding transformation whatsoever. And if one looks at the document, which is the ultimate cinching document and whole array of documentation, it's still in the New Testament. It's still there. It's in the Bible. Because the transformation process, even under aegis of a priesthood, was Jewish. I think you're aware Jesus was a Jew. His mother was a Jew. St. John was a Jew. St. Matthew was a Jew. St. Peter was a Jew. Now, under Judaic priesthood law, the effective transformation can only be done by the high priest. Every other healing, every other transformation is a resonance of a single act of transformation by a single figure once a year. Only the high priest may enter the Holy of Holies. Not just the temple itself, but within the temple is the Holy of Holies, which only the high priest can enter, and he can only enter once per year. I mispronounced it, Yom Kippur. On the Day of Atonement. And so in the New Testament, in the letter which is called, has come down through history as the Epistle to the Hebrews, which used to be thought that it was by St. Paul, and so it was preserved in the Bible. It's not by St. Paul at all. The Greek is totally different, and the understanding of Judaism is totally different. St. Paul was from Tarsus, which is today in Turkey. He was a Jew from Anatolia, on the outskirts, the hinterlands. I mean, Galilee already in Paul's time was the Wild West in the north. Tarsus is like the boondocks. Tarsus is like Saskatchewan compared to the Wild West of Nevada compared to Los Angeles. The temple is in Los Angeles. The Wild West of Galilee is out there in the Nevada desert, and in the Mackenzie territories is Tarsus. So Paul is like a provincial guy who has no learning. Right? So all of his learning was inculcated to him when he went to school, and his teacher was Gamaliel. And Gamaliel taught squared 4x4, Sanhedrin, ritual, Judaism. And Paul understood only that kind of Judaism because that's all he ever knew. That's it. And in that kind of Judaism, every year, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies and receives from God the power to consecrate, to receive his blessing. And the high priest radiantly comes out and shares that with the priesthood, and the priesthood shares that with the community. That's the way it was. And all of Paul's letters are based on that kind of understanding. And to him, Jesus was like a mysterious figure and not at all Jewish. Must be something completely new, completely mysterious. So he's the one who started using the term Christian in a very large city called Antioch in the 50s AD. And all of Paul's writings have that kind of understanding. And all of it is very much like Jung here saying, this event is necessarily a mystery. Paul says it's necessarily a mystery. All of Paul's letters say it's a mystery. All of Pauline Christianity is all based upon, well, this is a mystery. Transformation is a mystery. But when one reads the epistle to the Hebrews in the New Testament, it's not at all by Paul. The author was the number one priest in Alexandria. Alexandria is not at all Northwest Territories, not at all Nevada Desert, not even Los Angeles, but Manhattan, New York City, a big boy. And Epistles to the Hebrew is written in classic 12 by 12 rabbinical excellence. Classic, high educated, super intelligent priest, rabbi. And one reads in there very clearly that Jesus is a transformation of the priesthood because he enters the Holy of Holies of the universe and does that once and forever after. It's all done. Doesn't have to be repeated. That Yom Kippur is not the Yom Kippur of a sun cycle, of a single planet around a star, but is an eternal manifestation once. Doesn't have to be repeated. That openness is there forever. Where is it going to go? Where is it not going to be? It's like Queen Egg ending the necessity of passing on the lineage one by one and broadcasting it to the whole planet. Making it like radio waves everywhere, and anyone who can tune it in, it's there. When you tune it in, it's there. How do you tune it in? By making a space in your person, one energy quanta above the highest that you ordinarily use in your daily life. Now, in order to give an existential, defining image to that, somebody like Plotinus, in the middle of the 3rd century AD, understanding all this extremely well, and understanding how things had gotten confused in the 2nd century, and so setting to work and straightening everything out in the 3rd century so that this kind of shoddiness, this kind of flaw, this kind of mistake, this kind of illusion doesn't proliferate, set it all out. And we have his lecture still. It's called On Your Guardian Spirit. And the whole idea of a guardian spirit is succinctly there in Plotinus's Aeneid, On Your Guardian Spirit. Sometimes you can translate the Greek as tutorial spirit, teaching spirit. And he says very clearly, he says, your guardian spirit is always the next highest energy level from where you operate as a person. And as you raise your energy level higher and higher, your guardian spirit also ratchets up. And it isn't wishy-washy because this universe is such that actual existence is only by quanta. So there are definite energy steps and levels at which this registers, and they're not infinite in number. They're in fact 7 in number, because the 8th level is eternity itself, God himself. So that as you perfect yourself patiently by raising the level at which you are open to this mysterious universe, your guardian spirit goes up one level before you. And when you reach the 7th level of freedom, your guardian spirit is at the 8th level of freedom. And your guardian spirit becomes God himself. Now, this kind of understanding is there in the Epistle to the Hebrews. He says, what an amazing experience that our rabbi pioneered the faith in eternity completely. And you can read the whole thing for yourself. There are actually 13 sections because generally a cosmopolitan, urbane teacher like Apollos, after he finished the 12-part structure where every phrase is balanced with every other phrase so that you have a perfect composition. It's one of the most perfect compositions extant in high cosmopolitan Greek language with cognate Hebrew language structures and expositional structures built in. And the 13th section is the arm around the shoulder homily to let you go back into town, back out of the building, back into the melee of Alexandria. He says things like, anything that happens on the bed of love in your life is consecrated already. Don't worry about it. Because that's the kind of universe we have, freedom. This quality of transformation, tapping the eternal. One taps the eternal not through energy which you will, but through energy which is manifest because of openness. And so you have to learn to go with this kind of aikido of openness. Otherwise, nothing happens. What happens instead is an illusion that something has happened, and then believing that illusion, all of the actions based upon that spread what is called delusion. And so the world is largely a delusionary carnival called samsara. Almost nothing of it is real. It's like one of those Star Trek episodes where they finally smash the little magic wand of the magician, and all that's left are two little squeaky creatures from some other galaxy. And the little sons of bitches fold over into the dust and steam into non-existence. And Mr. Spock says, fascinating. It's mainly delusionary. But for someone who is needing to act upon and to believe in their delusions, what is delusionary is the transformation process. And the only way to accept it is to imagine some way by which it could work, which would itself be delusionary. And that delusionary imaginative placebo, because it is also delusionary, factors into a delusionary outlook without leaving a trace. Because delusions factor into delusions very easily. It's the universal law. But the transformational process itself works. But when it works in such a way that it registers existentially. But eyes that are used to seeing, ears that are used to hearing, minds that are used to conceiving, delusionally, do not notice something that's right there in front of them. And for someone who can see it, it's an amazing thing. You don't see this? And their reply usually is, you see something? How can we break this kind of regressive cycle? How can we get out of that? The first thing is that you have to understand that you yourself will not believe that you're in a delusion. The whole nature of a delusion is that you do not know that you're in a delusion and you cannot believe it. There's a classic story and a Chinese mystic named Chuangzi. I've told it before, I tell it again here. The emperor has this day where they're going to sacrifice this bull. And the Taoist cook comes out and he takes out his knife and he just quickly carves up the whole bull. And the emperor says, it's amazing. How did you do? Let me see that knife. And the knife is still very sharp. He says, how do you do this? And the Taoist cook says, well, Your Highness, most of these guys over here don't know how to cook. For real. They try to use their knives to cut through bone and cut through sinew and all the stuff, and that blunts knives. Whereas I know the structure of the ox. And by knowing its exact, articulate, real structure, I just cut in between everything. And because my knife never touches anything, it's always sharp like this. I can cut up many ox. It never will be blunt. You can live in such a way that you can cut alongside images. And you never have to blunt your insight. Never. Because it never touches anything. Because the articulation of images like that produces not just this kind of skin-tight space, but to the quality of the mind in its own nature, the mind qua mind, that space which to the worldly eye looks just like thin, one atom at a time membrane, to a higher energy level of one atom's thickness is a whole universe. On level of magnetoelectric energy, 10 billion times the frequency of electromagnetic energy, you have 10 billion times the space. The space of one atom is like 10 billion. You have all the space that you could ever conceive of. And so spiritual forms can move through this world without leaving a trace. They never touch anything. Why should they? You would have to go completely out of your way to run into something. It's a waste of time. So that transformation, the preparation, the preliminaries for transformation are all about articulation, about getting your images to be what they are, to be extant as they are, and not confused, not crabbed up, but articulate. And as one does so, what happens faster and faster, quicker and quicker, is that one learns to see whole gestalts. It's like somebody who reads one word at a time because you're pointing at the words. compared to somebody who just gets the whole paragraph. You can read a whole page in one glance. Just like that. It takes training, of course, but it doesn't take that much training to go above one word. And you don't have to be super yogi like that. There are people that can do that. There are people that can do this. Mr. Hall could do that. Ah, yes, it's... I don't have that kind of wild talent. Only kings have that. I'm just a messenger. The sky is falling. I didn't do it. Chicken Little with the emphasis on little. It's a whole quality that transformation happens not because we force something, but because we make a space available for mobility to happen. We get unlimbered. And when we get unlimbered, all of a sudden we're able to do a triple tuck somersault in midair, and we say, was that me? Yeah, that's you, as you really are when you're free. Free. Free is the ability for your existential posture to contort and move, and liberty is the space socially at which you can exercise your freedom. That's the difference between liberty and freedom. Freedom is a sociological manifestation of the individual, and liberty is a sociological event where that exercise takes place. It's a quality which we can appreciate here at this particular juncture, Vision 8. Let's run through it this way. I have a page that's numbered like Wittgenstein's 1.0, 1.1. In the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, he sort of like flaunted his logical acumen. Well, I'm not flaunting anything, I'm just cribbing here. So 1.1, nature integrates. His 1.1 was the world is everything that is the case, which assumes a lot. That's very full 1.0, and any programmer today would just scoff at him. But in the 1920s at Cambridge University, it was hot. It was very hot. I told that story about all the great logicians were there at the University of Cambridge around the turn of the century. Sri Aurobindo was there before he was Sri Aurobindo. He was Aurobindo Bose, and Bertrand Russell was there, and G.E. Moore, and Wittgenstein, and the place was packed with great logical minds. It was scintillating, and you dared not say anything because, you'd be criticized. One time, as the apocryphal story goes, the brilliant Bertrand Russell, who was the great Don in residence at Cambridge University, came into a sitting room, and there was G.E. Moore, the next in line Don, and he had this Scottish mohair blanket over his lap, and he had this basket, and there's a bunch of apples in there. And Russell comes in, and he says, Moore, do you have some apples in that basket? Hoping to get one. And Moore looked at him and sort of grinned in a kind of a Barry Fitzgerald way, and he said, no. And Russell, right away, the Earl of Pembroke, took the key, and he sort of slid into this sarcastic thing, and he said, Moore, have you any apples in that basket? And Moore, who was very sharp that day, kept his eyes on him, and he said, no. And so Russell, who was eternally sharp, finally got it and went through the permutations. He said, Moore, have you apples in that basket? And Moore said, yes. Would you like one? When language is articulate logically, there is only one right way to say something so that it exists. Now, people that don't like that, that criticize that, call that logical atomism, and that's exactly what it is, logical atomism. It was taken way beyond Russell and Moore. A guy named Austin and a guy named Searle took it to lengths that most programmers haven't even come upon yet. It gets downright scary. This quality of articulation by language existence can only be resonated further by language. Something that has existence is only what it is and nothing more. It has no resonance whatsoever beyond its existence without language. Language is the striking of existence into resonance. So that the most primordial form of language, the name is a resonance of the existence. And all the properties that are there in existence are also there in the resonances. That's why any permutations or operations done on the name changes the existence also. The power of language. If you keep the language in tune, resonantly in tune with existence, when you change the language, existence is changed. When you transform language, existence is transformed. It's extremely powerful. Very powerful. But language on these higher powers of resonance is indexed. It's like the back of a book, the index is indexed by symbols. Symbols index language. So if you're really sharp, I know what you're doing, you change the index symbols and you change the language, you change existence. But just like symbols index language, there is something which indexes symbols. What would index symbols? It's like a super index. That's the index of the symbols, and when you look past the index page, you come to a blank page. And that's exactly how it is. Realization indexes symbols. But it doesn't record. If you're not it, there's no way that you can know that it is. No way whatsoever. You can't, it's unimaginable. Why? Not because it's a mystery. There's no mystery at all. It just simply doesn't record. Now, how can you get at this? If it doesn't record, how can you get at this? The traditional wisdom way of getting at this is to learn that the only way that images can be articulate is in the mind, and that the mind must then develop space which allows for those images to come into play and to have existence. It's a tremendous step to have images occur in mental space. A tremendous step. It's an unbelievable, tremendous step. And what happens when those images record for the first time and make mental space for the first time, they are so fascinating, as Dr. Spock would say. They're so fascinating that the rote response is to illustrate it. And so Paleolithic images in caves are indication of mental space developing for first time. And you say, well, how can that be? Because up until that point, everything was in the cycle of nature. Everything was natural. Everything that happened was natural. Literally, there was nothing on the planet that was supernatural. But as soon as those images began to appear, about 30, 40,000 years ago, as soon as those images begin to appear, they're the reflex action of images beginning to seed mental space. Now, tens of thousands of years later, tens of millions of individuals later, there was enough mental space to, for the first time, conceive of an order which was very similar to the order of numbers, but which were images that took the place of numbers. And this was the beginning of literacy. And that literacy right away had a recursive function in that it appeared in expression. That happened only about 5,000 years ago. Now there's a point here that was lost on almost everybody until about 25 years ago. A man named Roy Harris got the idea and cinched it together, and he said in his writings on language and linguistics, he said, it's apparent now that numeracy precedes literacy. Numeracy precedes literacy. Because it's the numerate spatial series order that makes possible the image distribution in a linear series that makes what we call literacy work. The spaces and the series order have to be there before, because the images do not by themselves distribute in linear orders at all. They float free. And you have a devil of a time with children teaching them how to write because their initial images float freely. They like floating. They love it because that, and they know it, is real. This other is the beginning of something else, a whole different process. When that series order, when that linear order proceeds far enough, and one then takes the images out of those little railroad cars. Here's the train of thought, right? Train of thoughts a-comin', big black wheels humming. People waiting at the station, happy hearts are drumming. That's Johnny Cash's early hit in the 1950s called Train of Love. When that train of thought is on its tracks and you keep the boxcar shapes, but you empty out all the content so that there are just empty boxes, the train of thought maintains its existence as a form, but because there's no content, it tends to want to blank out into invisibility. And though it blanks out into invisibility in terms of content, it maintains its serial place as an order. And for the very first time, you can experience mind in terms of mind per se. Mind as a space which has order to it without content, and the ordering has a kind of, at first it's called, and generally it's called linear, but actually the better term for it is vector. It has a particular vector. What kind of a vector does it have? What, a vector is like an arrow? It means that you have something to say to someone about something. So that all language linearity happens to be, it's not like a train that's parked on the tracks, but a train that's going along those tracks is going somewhere. So in order to empty the content out of all those little boxcars, you also have to train yourself not to think about where it's going and not to think about where it came from. Because the origination of it and the destination of it give highlighted conditions of it. It's like a computer program where you outline everything in pink or blue or something. Yeah, you have empty boxes, but they're highlighted still. And they have that kind of a quality. And what you want them is to be like Wonder Woman's plane, completely invisible. Because then you also get the magic lasso. And then you can get those bad guys. Those resistances, then you can get them. And when you got them, remember that magic lasso? They have to tell the truth. Remember that? That's how it works. I didn't write the manual. I don't know. But that's how it works. Just like that comic strip. When you get that train moving, the emptying out of content is called abstraction. And one of the qualities of a true abstraction is that the origin and the destination of the trajectory of the meaning are also wiped of content. Otherwise, it's not a true abstraction. Now, this is very hard to do. It's extremely hard to do. The first human being to ever be able to do this was the historical Buddha, Siddhartha. Is the first one to be able to completely empty out place of origin, place of destination, all the content. About 2,500 years ago. 39 years ago. When this happens, when that condition happens, mind discloses itself in its existence. And when mind discloses itself in its own existence, one sees that the space that's made is not limited to the moving invisible boxcar. It's not limited to that at all. That there is no limitation to the space whatsoever, because the outlines that made the boxcars were conditions, secondary conditions if you like, but they were conditionals that were dependent upon remembering the origin and remembering the destination. So that all of a sudden you have this train moving that no longer has any tracks, it no longer has any outlines even, is not only invisible, but is indistinguishable from universal space of mind, and that mind has absolutely no limitations whatsoever. What are the capacities of human freedom? Worlds without end. There are none. There are none purely whatsoever. This is why realization is a freedom without conditions. No conditions. None. In order for any transformation to work, in order for it to have efficacy, existence has to undergo an experience on this invisible track without the boxcars even being outlined, much less have any content. All transformations that happen, and you can see that it's not just the Buddha historically doing this for the first time. It's not just Jesus entering the eternal Holy of Holies just one time for all eternity. Those are all true. Those transformations actually happen. There's no way to unhappen them. But it also applies to every single minute transformation that is real. They all participate in the same energy modulation that for an existence to go into a different form, it has to have passed through this openness, universal freedom. So that universal freedom, rather than being rare, is the most common aspect of the universe. What the Hasidic masters say. It's the most common imaginable. But because it's the most common, it is unseen. No one bothers to think much about it. And they imagine, well, it must be some fantastic thing. It must be unbelievable. Like one of the Baal Shem's stories of the rabbi who hears that this secret book has on the last page the secret of the universe, and that this book is in a locked, jeweled case, and that case actually is in a village within a year's walking distance. Why is he waiting? He goes. And he gets there, and he finds that indeed there is a wise man there. Indeed, there's a room just like he saw. There's a bed just like he saw. And there's a locked, jeweled case under the bed just like he saw. And he said, the book is in there, isn't it? And the master in that town says, yes, it's in there. And so the man opens it up, and he sees the book, and he turns the last page, and it's missing. He says, well, where's the last page? And the guy says, I thought you had it.